Shabbat Shalom, everyone. As I shared a little while back, make sure you can hear me, when I led a series of tefillin workshops in our religious school, I began to wrap tefillin, those phylacteries sometimes they're called, those black boxes with leather straps that are part of traditional Jewish daily prayer. An older girl at my school taught me one day at morning minyan. And I can still remember how she demonstrated each step, and I still think of that moment when I wrap tefillin today. First, tightening the first knot on my bicep, and then wrapping 7 times around my forearm, and then tightening the knot that goes around my head and the knot at the back of the base of my neck. And finally, and this is what I want to focus on this morning and share with you, the elaborate and beautiful tying around my hand and fingers as we say these words from Hosea, from the prophet Hosea. Ve'erastich li le'olam, I will be espoused, or I will be betrothed to you forever. We say that as we do one of the wraps. Ve'erastich li b'tzedek u'v'mishpat u'v'chesed u'v'rachamim, and I will be betrothed in righteousness and justice, and with goodness, with loving kindness, and with mercy. The third wrap is ve'erastich li le'olam ve'yadat et Adonai, and I will be betrothed to you forever, and then you shall be devoted to God. This is elegant, beautiful poetry that is symmetrical and really taps into the love and devotion between God and Israel, using this metaphor of betrothal, using this metaphor of romantic love. So surprisingly, for years this was how I understood this verse in a really beautiful, simple way. Surprisingly, when I studied these verses in my first year at seminary, my Bible professor opened her lecture on Hosea, this prophet, with a warning. She said, with some humor and a lot of compassion, she said, "This might ruin tefillin for you." And my heart sank, because as I just shared, and as many of you already know, I love tefillin, and I didn't want tefillin to be ruined for me. These lines that we recite when we wrap the tefillin are about faithfulness and devotion, but the story in the Bible is about an abusive relationship. The Israelites are practicing idolatry, and God is extremely angry. And so in Hosea, the prophet uses the metaphor of a marriage, the metaphor of God as a jealous and dominant husband, and Israel as a submissive wife who is straying from the marriage by worshiping other gods. Israel should be faithful to God, the husband in this metaphor, by only worshiping one God. And we can see in Hosea that as the cycle of abuse, some of us may be familiar with this, with the cycle of abuse as we understand it today, played out in this ancient text. First, tension builds. And then there is an abusive incident, an outburst. And then there is a period of reconciliation and maybe some calm for a while. And then tension builds again, and the cycle continues again. And in Hosea, this abuse is acted out on 2 levels. So we have this God-Israel metaphor, which is hard to wrap our minds around, but God as a husband and Israel as a wife. And we also see it in Hosea's own family. Beginning with his personal life, the very first words, the words with which God uses to call Hosea to be a prophet, are words of punishment. He is forced to marry and have children with an eshet znunim, which is even a stronger word, I think, than maybe what we would call a promiscuous woman. I'm going to put that in quotes. We have no reason to believe that Hosea has done anything to deserve this particular punishment, other than that he is a stand-in. He is being punished on behalf of the people Israel for the sin of idolatry. Hosea then has children, and God directs that the children's names should symbolize this sinfulness. So his third child is perhaps most dramatically named Lo Ami, meaning not my people. Child is named Lo Ami. And God finally says, I will not be your God. And then this dark period is followed pretty quickly with a period of reconciliation. A new chapter begins, and God promises that the number of people of Israel shall be like the sands of the sea, which cannot be measured or counted. Words which we might recognize as being the words of covenant used with earlier ancestors, with our forefathers. And then the cycle continues with, we've gone from peace and reconciliation and calm. The cycle moves into more cruel words and more threats of punishment. Again, using this marriage metaphor, God says, she is not my wife, meaning Israel is not God's wife. I will disown her children, for they are now a harlot's brood. These really painful, harsh threats of punishment continue and build and build. And this cycle continues until God promises a reconciliation with Israel. I will speak coaxingly to her and lead her through the wilderness to speak to her tenderly. God then vows to remain devoted to Israel forever, using this language from tefillin, from wrapping around the finger when we put on tefillin, the eras tichli verses. I will be betrothed to you. And then after a calm period, the abuse begins again, as God instructs Hosea to again find a promiscuous woman, just as in the metaphor. Israel is being, quote, I'm putting big quotes here, promiscuous by worshiping other gods. It is certainly painful to witness this cycle of abuse played out in our sacred texts. There is no question that is hard. And my professor was right to warn us, to explain to us that learning the context of these verses will change the experience of wrapping tefillin. I can never unknow this about those verses, about Hosea. But we need to know this. It's not something that I even now want to unknow. We must recognize patterns of abuse in our relationships and in our communities. We have to watch for these patterns and do what we can to support those who are in these patterns. Sometimes our Bible teaches us through role models. We should be like this great ancestor of ours. And sometimes, like in this case, our Bible teaches us through what I will call anti-role models. This cycle of abuse in Hosea is an anti-role model, also for us to learn from and also for us to reject. Of course, if Hosea is an anti-role model, our tradition has no shortage of positive role models in this context, I won't really begin because there are so many to count. but off the top of our heads, love your fellow as yourself. Let the honor, which is from the Torah, let the honor of your fellow be as dear to you as your own, which is from the Mishnah, the beginning of our rabbinic literature. And there are so many more. It is a Jewish value to treat others with respect and to honor the dignity of others and to take responsibility for each other's safety and security. So I will say that tefillin is not ruined for me. When I wrap tefillin, I now remember how deeply our tradition understands what it means to be human, to be in relationships, and calls on us to be better. The reality is that the cycle of abuse in this Hosea narrative is today as alive and relevant as it was in ancient times. I want to recognize the work of a local community organization, the Jewish Coalition Against Domestic Abuse, known as Jakeda, which serves the greater Washington area, the greater Washington community. Jakeda provides 100% free clinical services, so that includes safety planning and counseling, and 100% free legal services. That includes protective order, getting a protective order, that whole process, and any associated criminal proceedings. They also provide training for middle school and high school, and of course adults, to recognize the cycle of power-based violence and intimate partner violence. We are, in our community, committed to the mission of Jakeda, which I'll share is to support victims of intimate partner violence to become empowered and live safely, to educate the community about intimate partner violence and the appropriate responses, and to prevent future generations from experiencing intimate partner violence. As a community, we need to be present for one another. And I'll add that in our role as clergy, in my role as your rabbi, we are allies for survivors of domestic violence, of intimate partner abuse, domestic abuse. We are here, and we are listening, and we want to help. So I want to invite any contact, if we can be helpful, if we are the right people to contact in an emergency situation. Our emergency numbers are available everywhere on the website and widely. And if it's less of an emergency, but anyone could use support for any of the reasons that I've outlined today, or for any other reason, we have new ways to connect with us on a non-emergency basis. So you can call the office. You can email pastoral@bethelmc.org, and we will be in touch to schedule time to connect on that less urgent timeline. So I want to close. We got into some practicalities, which is important. I want to close with a blessing that we all have and find, if we don't have it already: safety and peace. Shabbat Shalom.